So let me start. First of all, how many of you are not with Cheppers? Just so I know. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, great. So this presentation will be very different from the one that I gave earlier today for those of you who are with Cheppers. Share my screen. Yes, okay. I'm so sorry.
And the presentation will be recorded.
Okay, actually, I just realized once again that I should use Chrome for this because Google likes to make it really hard for other browsers. Okay.
I think I have to down YouTube join again. Okay.
No, I think it's already in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Guess enough. Okay, so yes. How many of you have already heard of gatsby.js before? Okay. And how many of you have already done decoupled Drupal or headless Drupal already in the past? Okay, so a few of you. Okay, well, this is going to be about live preview with Gatsby and decoupled Drupal. What I want to do is, because it's a small audience, what I'll do is I'll go through some of the higher level information and the concepts, introduce you to some of the ideas about Gatsby and kind of the foundations of what Gatsby is all about. And then I would love to also introduce some code to you as well. How many of you are developers or design? Okay, so developers. Any designers here or UX? Okay, just so I know who I'm working with. I also like to call this presentation Gatsby Loves Drupal because you'll see very shortly why that is. But once again, I'm Preston. You may know me because I wrote a book about a year ago called Decoupled Drupal in Practice. It hasn't sold very well, but it's a book that is the only book currently that is a reference about decoupled Drupal. I work at Gatsby, and what I wanted to do today is to walk through some of the architectural principles behind why Gatsby is so interesting to a lot of people in our industry today. So first, before I start, if you are interested in Gatsby, there's a GitHub repository with our open source project, github.com/gatsbyjs/gatsby, gatsbyjs.org. We integrate with a lot of different CMSs. So if you've ever used any of the new headless CMSs that are emerging on the market today, like Sanity, Contentful, Datto CMS, please feel free to try those out and let me know what you think with our preview product. Once again, as I mentioned, I wrote Decoupled Drupal in Practice. I also, by the way, one other thing I wanted to mention is I run a conference in New York City, and I'd love to welcome all of you to New York as well to participate in Decoupled Days, which is the only conference about decoupled and headless Drupal in the world. So first, I want to briefly talk about kind of why it is that people are really interested in this approach in the first place. Why is it that decoupled Drupal is becoming such a big thing? And why Gatsby in particular? This goes a little bit beyond a lot of the things you may have read or heard about decoupled Drupal itself. How did we get here exactly? So we know from our work with Drupal that in the old days of Drupal, we usually had a process where they were static pages in Drupal. And most CMSs mostly operated this way. It was really focused on this notion of if you want to submit a form, if you want to do any sort of form state handling, you have to incur 2 bootstraps or 2 full kind of round trips with Drupal. You would click on submit, you would have a full page refresh, and then you would get the new state of the form. And that required you to go all the way back to the Drupal database and come back with the data returned. That changed, of course, with Ajax, because now with Ajax, we have the ability to use jQuery to introduce a little bit of dynamic behavior into our Drupal sites, which means that instead of having to wait for the page to refresh, we could actually insert dynamically and asynchronously some information on the page. And if you have been involved in the JavaScript community, or if you have been really involved in React or some of these new techniques, this is really the beginning of client-side rendering. You know, DHTML and this whole jQuery approach is really the start of client-side rendering as we know it today. Now, of course, today we have full component re-renders. So entire sections of the page, entire portions of the page are now re-rendered. And we use usually a JavaScript framework to do that. Something like AngularJS or Knockout.js back in the day. Or today, React, Ember.js, some of these other frameworks that you might know about. And of course, with the advent of universal JavaScript, it goes even further down the stack. Now we're actually even operating further backwards and allowing for server-side execution of JavaScript and facilitating this notion of not only do we have rendering taking place on the client side, but we can use those exact same techniques to do those things on the server side. And it's a very, very big step in this kind of history that we all share. So the Renaissance in JavaScript really ushered in this era of innovation, new practices, new best practices, and we see this especially with what happened with React. Node.js and universal JavaScript have really elevated JavaScript to this global reach that it really didn't have before. Many of us were growing up in our development careers back when JavaScript was really not a very, let's say, robust language. It was pretty hard to use. It was pretty bad, actually. It was actually not the best language. So let's talk about some of the biggest problems that occur with Drupal. There's a couple of things that are emerging now around the disadvantages that Drupal has today. The first is that the total cost of ownership is increasing. How many people pay for hosting for the Drupal sites in the room? How much do you pay?
Maybe $10.
$10? Okay. Anyone else want to be willing to share? Maybe you might reveal too much about your infrastructure?
$5 to decoupled.
$5, okay. Anyone paying more than $50 in the room? But we know, for example, that our clients, our large sites that we're building, are certainly paying more than $50 a month. So these solutions for hosting, these LAMP stack solutions, are very expensive. But now we're having the emergence of serverless solutions, like Netlify or Zeit. And Acquia, Pantheon, some of these older solutions are actually very expensive for these sites that we really need to be performant and stay online all the time. Also, we as Drupal developers are very expensive. We really are. We get paid very well. Maybe some of us. Certainly, I don't write much PHP anymore. I write mostly JavaScript these days. But Drupal is a very specialized skill. It's hard to find developers who are writing Drupal, especially the new kind of Drupal 8 techniques that we see today. Also, it's really hard to work with these modules. I mean, when someone decides to give up a module and say, hey, I really don't want to maintain this module anymore, it's too much work, it's just too much energy. When they go away, what are we supposed to use at that point? Think about the story of UberCart, right? How many people use UberCart, right? Yeah. So UberCart, when that went away, we were left without nothing until Drupal Commerce came along, and even that isn't necessarily a full replacement. So this notion of interchangeable parts is a very important part of the way in which decoupled CMSs are evolving. Also performance and speed, which we all know, and I won't even need to really talk about that because we know that very well. Also security, and this is something I didn't talk about earlier today when I spoke with the chapters team. Security is a very big concern. And one of the things that we found, especially in recent years, is that these vulnerabilities keep on increasing. Drupal is not a very secure CMS these days. Every few weeks, we have a new module with some kind of a security hole. Every few months, we have a new core vulnerability in Drupal that really jeopardizes our site's ability to stay online and stay secure. I lived through Drupalgeddon back in 2015. I know many of you did as well. Within about 12 hours within the announcement, my site was hacked, and I couldn't ever actually bring it back online because I was using shared hosting on GoDaddy, and it was a really horrible situation. So this is a really big problem. And so one of the big reasons why people are moving off of Drupal as a monolithic architecture is because they really don't want to deal with this kind of ability for an attacker to come in and instantly access the entire site and instantly access every single layer that's in a Drupal monolith. So interchangeable parts is a huge thing that's in vogue these days. People really like this idea. And there's also new ideas that are emerging in terms of development practices and developer workflows. One of the things that Drupal is really bad at is saying, hey, me as a themer, I'm writing a Twig theme, and I need a variable. I can't go and figure out how to write that variable into my theme myself. I have to go and tap on the shoulder, right, of my friend over here, Tomasz, and I say, hey, Tomasz, can you please write this function that will give me this variable? And it takes a couple days, right? Meanwhile, I'm just sitting here and I'm playing Fortnite on my cell phone, waiting for this to happen. So this kind of blocking development is really not good. And so decoupled CMSs and decoupled approaches allow for this pipelined approach where no longer are we blocked because we can operate according to a different model that I call API convergence. And I'll talk about that very briefly. The other really nice thing about this whole thing is that if you decouple Drupal, you actually get to the point where you can change out any of these front ends anytime you want to. Let's say you want to use Svelte.js, because that's the one that just came out 2 months ago and now is really popular. You can go ahead and use that instead and just change it out, but still keep your existing Drupal 8 backend in place. This is what I mean by API convergence. I don't know if many of you use kind of dummy APIs or Swagger or some of these tools, but dummy APIs are basically fake APIs, right? They're APIs that issue a standard response based on what you're requesting. But these APIs are things that don't actually exist. They're vaporware. They're completely non-existent. They're invisible. But what happens is front-end teams and back-end teams, they say, hey, I am a Angular developer. I'm going to build this application. You are a Drupal developer. Let's agree on what sorts of requirements I have of my data and in my theme and in my templating in Angular and what you can provide me through the API. Eventually, the back-end team starts to build that API out. The front-end team builds out the front end according to this dummy API with these test responses that don't actually exist, and they get the result that they want. We've all been through the Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 update, I think. That took me a long time. And during that time, we have to put our sites in maintenance mode. There's nothing that we can really do to kind of prevent this kind of long time where the site is going to have to be offline for at least some period of time. But the good thing is that if you use something like Gatsby, which is a site generator, and I'll talk more about what Gatsby is exactly soon, you avoid this situation. You can actually have updates that don't occur at the same time. They're completely separate from each other and independent. There's a new concept emerging called the Jamstack. How many of you have heard this term already, Jamstack? So Jamstack is becoming very popular as a term right now in Europe and in the United States. And really what it's about is this notion of a new CMS architecture or a new data architecture that focuses on 3 key components: JavaScript, APIs, and markup. At the end of the day, all we really need is a set of markup that is not something that we need to really worry that much about in the browser. It's something that's statically generated, it's server-side generated, and it's something that we no longer have to worry about in terms of security or performance or SEO. And these are things that are very important. And this is why a lot of these platforms like Netlify, Zeit are already becoming so popular. Netlify, for example, is growing extremely rapidly and just posted another round of funding. So this is another reason why we like to decouple our CMSs and move towards a new front end instead of the existing Drupal front end. Is because we want to do these things because we're developers that like new experiences. We're developers that like to try new things and keep on learning. But the problem is that when we move to this new architecture, there's a group of people that are left behind, and that's the content editors, it's the marketers who have to work with this CMS every single day. So one of the things that's really important in terms of a feature in Drupal is preview, right? The notion of draft content preview, the notion of taking a piece of content, I don't want to make it live right now, but I want to see what it looks like as if it were live. And that's really hard to do if you're using a React-based front end or an Ember-based front end or a Gatsby-based front end. One of the things that's important is that because of this whole notion of having these separate development teams, we shouldn't really need to have to know much about each other's systems, right? Drupal shouldn't have to know much about Gatsby. Gatsby shouldn't have to know that much about Drupal because of this notion of separation of concerns, right? We want to keep our structured data away from the presentational or aesthetic information that that data is going to be presented in. Preview isn't actually that hard of a problem, but being able to create an agnostic or generalized preview system is very difficult. So here's some of the issues that come about when you try to build preview, for example, for a React application or a Gatsby application. One of the things that you know is that the API layer, right? If you're using JSON API or GraphQL as your kind of topmost layer in Drupal, that's the contract. That's the place where these interactions happen. You want to be able to also maintain that high fidelity across devices. If you look at your application in mobile, or if you look at it on desktop, also, how do you actually keep your preview something that can be reviewed by other stakeholders? If you have a preview and you want to share it with your colleague who's located in Jür, right, or located in Debrecen, you have to be able to send them a link. You have to be able to send them something that will allow them to be able to see what's going on. And how do you do that if it's not something that is persistent, right? Also, how do you stage multiple changes? How do you take multiple changes of content and move them into a point where people can actually review them together? Then you've got two other issues that are very important. The first, of course, is authenticated content, right? How do you keep people from viewing content that they shouldn't really see? This is all about embargoed content, scheduled content, some of these things that are very important from a content governance point of view. And finally, what about build times? Gatsby is a site generator, which means that it has a certain amount of time that it has to spend to build out the HTML and CSS that ultimately emerges from this. So what exactly is Gatsby? And what exactly do we mean by what Gatsby is? So one of the things that I want to mention here is that a lot of us in the Drupal world, we have gotten used to the workflows that we work in today. We've gotten used to Composer, finally, maybe after a few years. We've gotten used to a lot of the ways in which we install Drupal sites and work with Drupal sites. But in the JavaScript world, things are very different. Things evolve very rapidly and change very rapidly, and it's not the same as it used to be. Getting started is really hard. If you want to write in ES6, for example, you have to figure out, how do I configure my Webpack? Am I going to use Babel? What linting am I going to use? What sorts of tools am I going to include? What am I going to do for unit tests? Am I going to use Jest? Am I going to use something else? These are all questions that we have to answer every single time we spin up a new JavaScript project. And it's a lot of work to think about this process every single time, because these tools are changing so rapidly. These ecosystems are evolving every single day and every month. But there's another issue as well, which is that the way that we actually manage this data is changing very rapidly. Even 5 or 6 years ago, it was unfathomable. It was unthinkable to use Drupal as an API. In fact, if you look at the history of the REST API in Drupal, the original reason why the REST API exists in Drupal is to enable content staging use cases, is to enable content synchronization across multiple Drupal sites. It wasn't actually about serving content to a kiosk, or serving content to a mobile app, or serving content to a JavaScript application. Getting all of this right is really hard, because you have to think about the data, you have to think about how you're looking at the APIs, you have to think about what tools you're going to use and what you're going to declare as your dependencies. And getting all this right is really hard. Gatsby is very opinionated, which means that it makes a lot of those decisions for you. And you might not be as comfortable with that, and that's why a lot of people choose to use React or Next.js or some of these other tools. But Gatsby is a shortcut. It takes care of all of that boilerplate for you, right? A lot of this kind of notion of, I'm going to take Jest, I'm going to take Babel, I'm going to take use Webpack to manage all of these things. But there's a reason why people like Gatsby more than some of the other tools that are out there. And there's 3 really big components of Gatsby. And I want to show you all of them at the end of this presentation as well, and walk you through what they look like one by one. Gatsby consists of 3 key components. The first is the integration layer. Gatsby is one of the few frameworks that really focuses on integration as one of its most important components. As you can see here, one of the great things about Gatsby is that, yes, it has a plugin ecosystem, just like Drupal with its module ecosystem, but it also has what's called a source plugin ecosystem. And source plugins are direct connectors. They're very similar if you've used Ember.js to kind of Ember adapters, if you've ever used Ember adapters. And what they do is they retrieve all the data from an API that's available in a service, pull it down, and make it available within Gatsby for you to use and query. And we have a lot of integrations that are first-class integrations with a lot of different technologies. So that includes GraphQL APIs, it includes Contentful, WordPress, Drupal, Prismic, Shopify, even things like Google Sheets, Airtable, MongoDB, many of these tools that we use on a daily basis. That's the first component. The second component of Gatsby is that all of this data is really different from each other, right? Think about the fact that when we consume Drupal, that data is very different, and we have to look at that data and consider that data very differently from Shopify's APIs, or from Contentful's APIs, or from WordPress's APIs, because they're not built the same way, and they're completely different from one another. So what Gatsby does is it actually takes all of this data and puts it into a unified, agnostic GraphQL API, which means that at the end of the day, no matter where your Drupal data is coming from, JSON API, you are using a GraphQL API to query all of this information, regardless of where it's coming from. It could be coming from Contentful, it could be coming from Drupal, WordPress, whatever. It's all coming into the same GraphQL API. The third component of Gatsby is React. And how many of you have built a React application? Yeah. Okay. So React has several things that are really great going for it. The first is that there's what's called declarative rendering. React has a technology within it called JSX, which allows you to basically write HTML, but under the hood, it's all JavaScript. And JSX allows you to really write kind of HTML-like usages of data, and I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit as well. Also, there's a term that's called collocation, which is a best practice in terms of developer experience in React. What that means is when you use data, when you render data, that should be in the same file, ideally for your convenience, as the queries that you are issuing to get that data from your services and your systems. Which means that every single React component, right, should have theoretically an ability to say, here's my data, and here's how I'm going to render it. There's currently a big discussion going on Twitter about this right now, which I'm not going to get into. But if you are following a lot of React.js Twitter accounts, you'll see this debate happening quite a bit about kind of the life cycle around data fetching and rendering. So as I mentioned, Gatsby removes that boilerplate. And we also do a lot of improvements around front-end performance. So you don't have to worry about front-end performance. One of the things that our founder, Kyle Matthews, likes to say is that all slow websites are different, but all fast websites are alike. And it's very easy in Gatsby to build fast websites. You can also consider Gatsby as an app compiler for React. It is possible to build kind of dynamic applications with React as well, with Gatsby as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit as well. So the goal of Gatsby is to make this kind of process of web development, these challenges around web development, to be more powerful and more simple by the day. Now, why is it that Drupal and Gatsby get along so well? So the project lead of Drupal and founder of Acquia, Dries Beckett, wrote this blog post in the early months of this year, saying that a lot of these Drupal developers are becoming harder and harder to afford. We're all very expensive people. And actually moving to a more JS-driven or a more React-driven front-end can actually help resolve some of those staffing challenges. What's great is that JSON API is part of Drupal core, which means that after only a few clicks, you get a headless CMS out of the box with Drupal. You have the benefit of enabling a module, and you instantly get a fully RESTful and a fully REST-compliant API that has linking, has relationships, has everything you need for any application that you want to build. As I mentioned earlier, Gatsby has what's called source plugins, and Gatsby Source Drupal is a very powerful plugin. We actually just merged in another improvement today, where if you delete something through JSON API, it will be recognized within Drupal. And Gatsby Source Drupal is a very powerful tool because it allows you to pull data in from any Drupal 8 site that has JSON API enabled and use that within your Gatsby architecture. Also, Drupal and Gatsby both have really great communities, very large active communities that are very excited to help, very passionate people. And there's already sites that are live that use Gatsby and Drupal together. There are also very famous Gatsby sites that are just using kind of Gatsby on its own, including reactjs.org. So if you've ever looked at React.js's documentation, that's all actually built in Gatsby. Also, Impossible Foods, if you are looking for meats that are not made of animals, Impossible Foods is a site that uses Gatsby as well as many others that are out there in the wild today. But one example of a Gatsby site that actually is with Drupal is a site that is made by Media Current, an agency out in Atlanta. And City Springs is an urban development that has just started in Sandy Springs, Georgia. And this site has a lot of richness, has a lot of features that are really interesting that use Gatsby to a big extent. Also, Third and Grove, which is an agency that is located in Boston and Oakland in the US, they've just recently built their entire site on Gatsby and Drupal, and it performs very well. I mean, you go to the site, it loads within a couple seconds. Okay, so at this point, I'd love to stop for any questions for right now, but I'm thinking right now, I'd love to just switch to a live demo because I don't think it's very interesting to keep looking at slides. Any questions? All right. So let me start by, so some of those of you who are with the Cheppers team, this will be a little bit of a repeat. But what I want to show you is kind of those three components that I mentioned. So setting up this kind of live Drupal, live preview thing with Drupal is very easy. But what I want to do is I want to show you a couple of different things. So let's say that I want to actually build a new Gatsby site out. One of the things that you might want to you'll want to do is actually install the Gatsby CLI. That's npm install Gatsby CLI. You'll need npm and Node.js, obviously. I've already got it installed, so I don't really need it. But what I did earlier is I actually created a new site. So the way that you do this, and I'm going to actually go through this because I want to kind of, let's call it new site, or UI site, maybe. What is website, by the way, Majoro? Website. Huh? So when I use the Gatsby new command, what you see that's happening here is that we're actually using a scaffolding tool to issue this kind of boilerplate Gatsby site. It's a hello world Gatsby site, and I'll show you what that looks like. Whoops. Okay, there we go. Now, if I go to this new site and I type Gatsby develop, what you'll notice is Gatsby already comes included with a lot of things that are really useful. So let me close this now. This is not useful anymore. Just make sure I've gone through all the content. Okay, yeah, I'll go through this later on. But excuse me. So if I go to localhost, my local development environment, oops. This is the Gatsby default starter. So when you type Gatsby new and you just type a directory, this is what comes out. Has a couple of nice things here. I can go ahead and open this up in my code editor of choice. I don't know if you all prefer VS Code or Atom or Notepad++ or subtle. Okay, oh, Notepad++. Yes, good. Yes, good. VI, anyone use VI? Okay, good, good. So what you'll see here is when I open this up, there's this directory here called pages, right? And if you're familiar with React, you can consider that to be kind of like routes in React. But what you'll see here is just kind of this JSX kind of component here that has all this nice stuff going on and links also to this page. Very cool. Okay, interesting. Not that exciting, right? But that's kind of how you get started with Gatsby. So instead of really going into that, though, what I want to do is I want to show you my personal site. So if you haven't been to my personal site, it's Preston.so. And there's certain kind of sections that are on my personal site that are really interesting. My personal site, by the way, I pay $0 in hosting. I don't pay any money to host my personal site because I'm using a Pantheon free tier Drupal site, which means I don't care about the domain that it's on. And I'm using Netlify to provide both the custom domain and also my Gatsby hosting. So it's I pay $0 for hosting. So if you're paying $5 a month for hosting, think about the money you could save. You know, you could buy some Pantheon with that. You know, it's so what you'll see here is that I've got kind of 3 sections on this that are using 2 different CMSs. So this section is actually a blog, and this blog is actually coming from Contentful. I'm using Contentful to write this content, and I'll show you what that looks like from the Contentful side, just so you have a full picture of what this looks like. So I'm authenticating into Contentful, and as you can see, these are where all my blog posts are. So I like it because, you know, for me, Contentful has a much nicer experience in terms of editing blog posts. I really like this kind of user experience. It's very nice. Somewhat better, I think, than the default Drupal experience. So that's my Contentful kind of site. I also have a speaking section here, which is all my talks that I've ever given. Now, the talks actually come from my Pantheon site. And this is my Drupal site that's hosted on Pantheon with all of the talks that I've ever given. So that's kind of what my site looks like. And now I'll show you what it looks like under the hood, right? So by the way, if you want to take a look at my code base, it's at github.com/Preston So, Preston-so. This is the GitHub repo if you want to take a look. If you want to clone it, you can also use it for your own purposes if you want to do some stuff. Yes, I know GitHub. But these are all things that you can see that are if you want to try to use, try this out for yourself. This is one of the few sites that I know of actually that has multiple CMSs in Gatsby. There's not many people who do multiple CMSs with Gatsby. But all right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the code. So if I do Gatsby develop, Gatsby develop, there we go. These MacBook keyboards are very bad. As you can see, helpful suggestions from Gatsby. They knew that I was trying to type develop, so they suggested it. Okay, so this is very fast. Let me walk through what's going on here. So as you can see, there's kind of two major things that are happening right there. Number one is we're fetching data from Drupal. We're getting all the data coming out from Drupal. Then we're getting all the data coming out from Contentful. After that, what we're doing is we're building out the GraphQL schema, which means that we're going to build out the GraphQL API in Gatsby. Then we create pages. So this is the kind of process by which Gatsby generates pages based on the templates that you provide and all of the data that has just come in. Now I've got my local environment available. And what you can see is that when I go to my local host, this site is what loads, just like what you see on my live site. Okay, so let me walk through the code just a little bit briefly before I go through kind of a bit of a demo. What I want to do is I want to show you my personal site. Every single Gatsby site comes with what's called a Gatsby config file. And this Gatsby config file is kind of the site metadata, and it also has, as I mentioned earlier, the plugins that are part of Gatsby's ecosystem. So I'm using several plugins here. These are not as important for our purposes, but the most important two right here are Gatsby source Drupal, and this is where I'm configuring my URL, my base URL for my Drupal site, and then my Contentful site as well. And how many of you are familiar with environment variables in Node.js and how those work? Yeah, so one of the things that's really important about JavaScript is that when you're trying to integrate and consume data from other sources, you oftentimes have to authenticate into those systems. You don't want to have that information like your password or your API token inside your repository. Environment variables are a way, like you see this file right here, .contentful.json. I'm not going to click on that because that's got all my API tokens. Not that I think that, well, this is being recorded, so someone would actually go in and actually access my API. But what you see here is that we're actually using that .contentful.json file to allow me to leverage the authentication, and then I get my configuration, and I get the data that I need. And I'll show you more about that in just a second after I show you a couple of other things. Do you remember how I said that there's the integrations, right? And these integrations are really important to the way Gatsby works. Right there is where these two integrations are declared. But the second part of what I said about Gatsby is that there's also the GraphQL API. Now, think about if you go to my Drupal site and you type in /JSON API /node/article, right? Or sorry, not /article, /talk, because I'm using a custom content type. What you get here is you get a whole bunch of data, right? But this is fine. I mean, this is how we would normally use a JSON API backend with Drupal. But this is very different from all of the other systems that we might want to integrate with. These are very different from the kinds of other tools that we are using on our backend. So what I want to show you now is how GraphQL looks, right? And how this actually works from that perspective. When you spin up a local Gatsby site, if you type /___GraphQL, you get this really nice graphical interface, this GraphQL viewer. If you've ever used GraphQL, this is very familiar to you. And what I can do is, rather than having to go through and use JSON API, which I'm not as familiar with, I might not know as well, all I have to do is use the Gatsby GraphQL API. And as you can see, I've got two types of data that I can retrieve here. The first is right there, my Drupal data, right? And it's all bundle and then the name of the content type. Below that, you see the contentful data as well. As you can see, it unifies all of this data into a single queryable API. Now, if I go ahead and query into a single one of these nodes, what you'll notice is if I type field, there's all my Drupal fields right there. Gatsby source Drupal takes care of all of this for me. So I can say, well, hey, let me get field event, let me get field, let's get location. Boom. Now I have a list of all of my events that I've ever spoken at, as well as where they're located. Now, what I can do with GraphQL, of course, is you can also alias. And if you've ever used GraphQL, you know that this is something that you can do as well. Oftentimes, developers, especially in the JavaScript community, don't like to use variable names with underscore or use invoke objects that have underscores in them, for example, in terms of the names. So that's a way that we can help their developer experience. But OK, so that's the Drupal side. What about contentful? So let's take a look at contentful article. Once again, we go in and access a single one of these entities. And you can get some really interesting information out of this, like the slug. You can get the title. We can also get like the body as well, which might have something inside it. No, it doesn't. Or we can get something like the original publication date. That's a custom field, by the way, that I've created in contentful. Oh, yeah. So graphical just predicted this. I knew that there was something inside there. But this is actually not correct. This should be, there we go, content. That's what it is. Yeah, so now what you see here is I've got my title of my blog post. I've got the slug, which is the path. And now this is a really interesting part here. Contentful allows for you to write rich text in terms of the body field. Now, it's basically this very complex AST that you have to traverse in order to get the formatting to work correctly. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But this isn't working properly because I'm using this differently. Oh, see, this is not correct either. So the query is correct in my code. I just can't do it live because I can't remember what the name of the field is. But as you can see, this is the kind of thing that really makes developing very easy, right? Because you can instantly do a lot of this work and test this very easily and see this happen. And that's the GraphQL API portion of this. OK, great. Now let's talk about the React portion of this, because I think that's where we can combine all of this interesting information into a single place. So in my speaking.js file, which is my page for speaking, one of the things you'll notice is that here's my GraphQL query, the one that you just saw that I wrote. Now, one of the most interesting things you'll see here is that I'm using the aliases that you saw before, but I'm also doing a sort operation here. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that Gatsby is a site generator, which means that if you were to do one of these queries with a sort operation for a dynamic application like React, which is constantly having to query again and again and again, this is actually going to create a performance bottleneck. It's going to slow your performance down because of the fact that now you have to wait for the sort operation to complete. It's more computationally complex. But because this actually occurs at build time, which means that it's just generating HTML and CSS, I don't have to ever worry about the fact that this sort operation will incur a certain amount of delay in my performance and incur a performance bottleneck. And as you can see, I've done the aliasing here. And what I'm doing now is, now that I have this query, and this is what I mean by collocation, right, is that in this exact same file, I'm also using this data in my Gatsby component. So what you see here now is I've got each individual piece of data I'm using here is according to that GraphQL query. And it's perfectly, it's really easy to use. It's really nice and easy. And I don't really need to worry. I can use things like declarative rendering and conditional rendering in React that are very powerful and very easy to use. This is very different from the Twig approach that we're very used to, right? Because Twig, what we see is that it's kind of a blank, it's kind of a black box. We write Twig templates, but we have no idea where the data is coming from. And we have no way to change what that data looks like unless we go into PHP and start to write preprocessed functions, or start to use something like GraphQL Twig, which is still very unstable. So this is how collocation is a really powerful best practice and works really well. Now I'll show you my contentful. And this is my kind of the article teaser page. So this is the page that you saw, which was just the list of blog posts, this thing. So all of these are coming from here. And I'm using an article teaser component. That's a custom element that is in JSX. And as you can see, I'm also using this query to give me all of those titles and all of those links. If I go into an individual article, however, this is the template that I'm using. So I'm querying each article, and as you can see, I made the mistake of querying for the wrong thing. It should be JSON. And what you're seeing here is that every time I want to do this, and this is what I was talking about with that very complex AST, is that there's this really nice library called document to React components, which will convert this rich text AST in Contentful into this really nice thing. But it means I have to configure this in this really complex way. I don't like this personally. I've complained to Contentful about this, but I don't think they're going to change it. So, because too many people rely on this now. But as you can see, this is what makes it really flexible, because you could use other formatting tools here. You could, if you wanted to, you could use XML, right? You could put this in XML if you wanted to, or do some other kinds of things with it. That's why Contentful did that agnostic approach. So that's what I mean by co-location, what I mean by kind of this really big benefit of declarative rendering. Great. So that's all well and good, but we're also interested in preview. We're interested in talking about kind of, okay, so this is great for the developer, right? The developer likes this experience. We really enjoy this. It's really fun to use. But how does it work for the content editor? Let me rewind a little bit. You remember how we had that Gatsby config file with all of this stuff here? So this is all local on my computer. So whenever I spin up a local environment, that's the credentials that I'm going to use. Luckily, gatsby.js also has a platform. And we have a new product called Preview. It's an open beta right now. You can try it out with a 14-day free trial. And what you can do is, for example, if I go to my site, one of the things I can do is if I go into Previews, you can see in my site settings that I've set all of my environment variables here as well, so that now also my deployments and all of my production environments can use this as well. It's got my contentful access tokens, got my Drupal URL, all the things that we might want to hide from other people. I don't really care because people can access my Drupal site. It's not important. I'm going to talk about this in just a moment, but let me walk you through kind of a really cool demo first. So many of us have built decoupled sites before, but that's one of the things that holds us back, right? Is the notion of preview and the notion that our customer still needs to be able to see all of these things previewed before it actually goes live. So I'm going to go ahead and split this up into two screens so you can see what I'm about to do. This right here is my previews tab in Gatsby.js. Every single time I push a new code change, a new preview instance is created. Or sorry, a new preview, this preview instance is updated. It's a persistent preview instance. What I've done here is on my Drupal site, I've got a couple of modules that are enabled, right? So I've got JSON API enabled, which is good to go. Then I've got this other module, which is Gatsby Live Preview, drupal.org/project/Gatsby. And this module, what it enables you to do is to go ahead and enable you to actually configure my preview instance here. Now, as you can see, it's the same URL, right? I save this configuration, and you only need to do this once, okay? Now, when I go to this link, this is a staged preview instance that is my site as it normally operates. And if I go to one of these talks, right? As you can see, here's some of the talks I've given. Let me go and edit one of these so you can see what the preview functionality looks like on this, right? So let's take the one that was in Bulgaria, for instance. And let's say I want to say, right? Watch carefully, right? When I hit save, you see? You see? All right. Let me just do that again. Let me just show that to you again. Right? No. It updates even more quickly than the Drupal page itself is even able to go back to the server and come back with the response. I mean, that's pretty cool, right? And I need to delete this now because I know that last time I gave this demo, I left this up there. So there was like a whole bunch of demo text in there. Once again, boom, it's gone. So you're probably wondering, how did that work? Okay, that was some magic. How does that work? I'll tell you how it worked. What's really nice about this whole approach is that we're basically keeping a persistent preview instance alive. That's just a staged version of our Gatsby site. Every time a piece of content is updated in Drupal, what happens is it issues a post request to a webhook URL that we have configured here. This one right here. Whenever data is updated, issue a post request to this hook with a JSON blob this webhook, with a JSON blob that contains just the content that you've just updated. And that's how it works, is that as soon as this webhook receives that information, it instantaneously updates the content based on where it is in the Gatsby code. So that's preview with Gatsby. Live preview, as you can see, this is a very powerful feature because none of this is live, by the way. I haven't taken any of this live. None of that content is ever going to end up on my live site unless I rebuild my Gatsby site. So that was live preview. And now I'll finish with a couple of more kind of insights into how this works. And I'm really glad I was able to do that live demo because sometimes I can't really do the live demo based on the Wi-Fi. And the Wi-Fi here is very good. So what are some of the new features that are coming up? There's a lot of new features coming up, by the way. A lot of you are wondering, okay, that's a very simple demo. I mean, come on, you change the node title. Like, right? That's really easy, not that difficult. What about stuff like, paragraphs or draft content or, content moderation? That's coming. So the first thing that we've done is that a lot of us in the Gatsby Drupal working group, which is a group of folks that are across Gatsby and Drupal, we've started to work on several projects. The first is what's called the Rain Drupal distribution, which is really focused on this notion of using Gatsby with Drupal. Also, we're working on support for content moderation, which is a very important piece of this whole puzzle because we need to provide for content moderation, and also an even more real-time preview with a keystroke by keystroke preview. The other things that we're doing are actually related to kind of some of the more infrastructural things. One of the things that Drupal needs is a kind of sync API to enable these improvements to happen very quickly. And we're also working on a user experience that will allow for this kind of experience, where integrated within your paragraphs and your editing interface, you have a button that says Open Gatsby Preview, so you can go instantly to that link without having to copy the URL and figure out how to get there, just like I did. That's what Rain looks like. Next thing that we'll work on is kind of really making it much easier to do this on a lot of different kind of use cases. So Gatsby's ready for you to try today. I highly recommend you try out the Gatsby Preview platform and try out this product. It's very powerful, and it's really cool. I mean, you get all the benefits of the kind of static site revolution, the Jamstack. It's great for CMSs. Gatsby's really, really well built for CMSs. First-class support for Drupal. You can pull content from any Drupal 8 site. It's not for Drupal 7, I'm afraid. And then also, you can use this GraphQL API to really look at data coming in from a whole bunch of different places. Doesn't really matter where you are. And you can display your pages, of course, with all of the great best practices that are coming out of the React ecosystem. So try it out today. But before I end, what's next? I want to share with you some of the new things that are coming into Gatsby. And a couple of us talked about this today earlier during my talk with the Cheppers team. One of the things that is really problematic about this whole kind of build-based experience, this Jamstack experience, is that let's say you have 50 pages, right? Okay, that's fine. The process to retrieve all of that data and to render it out, as you saw in that log, is not that long. Maybe a few minutes. But what happens when you have a site that is a very large site? For example, a Hungarian news site that has 500,000 or 1 million or 5 million pages. That build could take hours or even days to actually complete, especially if you have a lot of relationships and a lot of references to other content. So one of the things that we're working on at Gatsby is to improve our build times. Most Gatsby sites will build in about 30 to 90 seconds, which is great. It's okay. It's pretty good for most sites, but it's actually unacceptable for others, like the use cases that I mentioned. So the faster that we can make builds, the more people will use Gatsby. Luckily, Gatsby version 2, which was just released about, I don't want to make a mistake, so I'll just say some months ago, is about 50 to 60% faster than the first version of Gatsby. And we're also building what's called incremental builds. And incremental builds is going to be a service that's going to be offered for Gatsby that will basically allow for only those pages that have data that has changed to be rebuilt. This requires a lot of work on both sides. That's why we're building a sync API in Drupal to be able to kind of provide that differential of what changed. And in Gatsby, we're also working on, first and foremost, parallelized builds and then incremental builds that will allow for kind of this really rich experience where only those pages that have changed will be rebuilt and the rest of the site stays the same. Our goal is to average less than 1 second build times, which is a very, very ambitious goal. And that would kind of help us achieve this vision of real-time streaming builds, or as close to real-time as possible. So builds will feel invisible. Also, decoupling Drupal by default. There's going to be a lot of work to make this kind of this demo I showed you a lot easier, so that you can spin that up without having to worry about a lot of the configuration. So it's much more of a quick and easy, seamless transition. The other thing we're working on, by the way, and I want to mention this very briefly because you might have heard about this on the grapevine, themes. We know themes in Drupal. We know themes. They're the templates, they're the things that we use, PHP template and all of that. What are themes in Gatsby? Themes is actually kind of a bad name for what we're talking about in Gatsby. Basically, themes are essentially pre-packaged Gatsby sites in and of themselves. So consider the fact that you can create a Gatsby site with 2 other existing Gatsby sites that are packaged as themes. So let's say that one of those is like a sidebar with some forms on it. The other one is some content, right? You can actually bring those 2 themes together into a single site and have those be separate dependencies and separate encapsulated things. So you don't ever have any collisions between those 2. So theme authors will be able to expose configuration, allow users to override things like design tokens, colors, components, so on and so forth. This is pseudocode, by the way. This is not real code. But it's basically saying that a single Gatsby site can be a function of multiple themes, which is very unique and isn't something that we really have in Drupal, right? You can't really install 3 themes and use them all on the same site. That's not really possible. But you can do things like base themes and child themes, which also exists in this approach, as you can see here. You can create your own base theme, obviously, great things. Gatsby's ready, please try it out. Themes are really cool. They're something that's quite unstable still. They're still in development, but a lot of people are using them already. Many of the famous React kind of community members and Gatsby community members are already using themes. I haven't had time to convert my site into a theme yet, but I probably will at some point. By the way, if you're interested in more information about what I mentioned earlier around the changes in CMS architectures and development best practices, the first blog post on my site is a really useful blog post, and köszönöm szépen. Any questions?
I think I have a question.
Sure.
It's your presentation was amazing, and the Gatsby is very cool. But how we can sell the clients? Because you have a Drupal with the ugly team, and it's right. And you have a live site with a nice theme and real-time refresh content. And how can we sell to the client?
Yes, that's a very good question, and I think it's a very relevant question for everyone here. Just to repeat, I don't know if that caught you, the mic, but how do you sell Gatsby to clients, right? When it's cool, but you need to really go deeper into the features that the client wants. What I will say is that I would not recommend selling Gatsby and Drupal to a client that has very complex requirements. And an example of this is like multilingual, or authentication, or if you need Drupal forms, or if you need Drupal search. I mean, those are things that Gatsby doesn't really work well with at all, partially because of Drupal, partially because of Gatsby, right? So what I would say is that this is why the vast majority of sites that are using Gatsby right now with Drupal are personal sites, portfolio sites, and agency sites that aren't that complex, or very content-focused websites that don't have a lot of rich functionality. What I would say is that one of the things that you can do, though, to make this easier is to, preview is obviously part of that, but it's not 100% of what you need. And that's one of the biggest issues that we face. And I think that the integration needs to be much deeper and needs to be much more focused on those use cases before, for example, Cheppers, or I don't know, what other companies do you work for, by the way?
I work at Integra Vision.
Okay. So it's going to be very hard for all of you to sell these solutions because you don't have all the things that people really like about Drupal incorporated into your kind of Gatsby integration. Until those exist, I think it's going to be challenging. And so that's why I recommend primarily using this solely for kind of content sites that are very simple and don't require a lot of that rich functionality. There are other options. Obviously, you can use other third-party services, but I would check back in a few months because it'll improve more and more over the course of time. We've already made some improvements. Actually, just this week, we merged in a change that makes it even better with JSON API, so that if you make a change in content and JSON API removes a resource, now Gatsby recognizes that. That's just part of kind of the first step of that integration improvement that we need to see.
Thank you very much.
Has there been any security vulnerabilities related to Gatsby in the past, or is it possible at all?
It's really, if you're using Gatsby to generate your static site, you don't have any security vulnerabilities at all because it's generating HTML and CSS. I mean, HTML and CSS, you can't hack, right? I mean, CSS maybe a little bit, but you can't hack HTML and CSS at all, right? There's no way to hack it. However, what is a potential for vulnerability is that there is the performance enhancements that happen after you finish. So what happens is when you generate your Gatsby site, right? You get HTML and CSS that gets pumped out to your browser. Then React is initialized because there are certain performance benefits that I can show you right now. Like, let's say my personal site. One thing you'll notice is, let's just go to my personal site in private mode so I can show you this. So my site loads very quickly, right? But if I click on each of these pages, it's instantaneous, right? There's no, there's no, all right. That's a bug, not a feature. I need to fix that. But as you can see, I don't know why that happened. But as you can see, all of these changes are happening very quickly, right? There's no kind of latency. That's not because of that's partially because of the fact that Gatsby is a PWA as well, but also because of the fact that Gatsby also loads React after the fact to do things like link prefetching, to do things like code splitting, and that's where potentially vulnerabilities could be introduced. But it's React, so there's a very a large security team involved in React. They're focused on security much more than they used to be now, I think, as well. So it's very hard to actually hack Gatsby, very hard. I would say it's actually more risky that you would have your Drupal site hacked than your Gatsby site hacked.
Thanks.
See, Veshan.
Can you tell a little bit more about theming and what would you call a component if you would use any?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We don't really have like a very good kind of, there's a lot of videos out there, but there's very few kind of demos of themes that are really easy to look at on Gatsby. And that's because it's being developed actively right now, so it's changing very fast. But a very good example of a component that you would use as a Gatsby theme would be like, for example, a sidebar that you want to repeat on multiple sites, for example. Let's say that you have 3 different websites that are separate Gatsby sites, but they all, you want to put in like the same kind of branded toolbar across all of them, or a sidebar that is shared on all of them. You could just declare that theme as a dependency and then use them on all 3 Gatsby sites. And that's how it would work really easily. Yeah. However, if you want, I can send you some more links about Gatsby themes. The videos are very nice. It's, right now it's really unstable. I mean, it's not even in, I don't even think it's in beta yet. There's just so much change happening that I don't want to show you any code because it's going to be out of date very soon.
Because of this team combining?
Yeah, it's because of several reasons. So it's because there are different ways in which people want to use themes. For example, like if you want to override a design token, right? You want to override a color in a different theme. You can do that, but it takes a very kind of particular approach to do that because you need to kind of configure it a certain way, and the configuration is where the specification is evolving a little bit. So it's not necessarily stuck on this is how you override this variable. It's still in a bit of flux. That's the kind of use case that's still evolving. So,
Is there a dedicated testing suite for Gatsby, or does it make any sense at all?
So you can do test-driven development with Gatsby. Gatsby has its own test suite inside of it that you can use if you want to. I believe it's based on Jest. Good question. Let's look. I don't really. I mean, honestly, I'm really lazy, so I only do test-driven development if I have to because I'm just lazy. But let's see the docs here for this and I'm only using it for my personal site, so and I'm really focused on the integration side of things. I'm less focused on the testing side. But there should be a thing here about testing. Yeah, let's just look in the. Yeah, there we go. Here we go. Testing. Yeah. You can. Yeah. So Jest. Yep. Jest. Yeah. There's also end-to-end testing. Cypress. That's what we use. Yeah. We use Cypress as well. So. Okay. Jo. Gestern steppen.